Berlin, December 21st, 1938. The Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Chemistry stands in darkness, its windows blacked out against the winter cold. Inside, on the third floor, a single lamp burns in Laboratory 22. Otto Hahn sits at a workbench, surrounded by glass beakers, lead containers, and sheets of photographic paper, showing strange patterns of radioactive decay. He has been bombarding uranium with neutrons for weeks, attempting to transmute elements, to unlock the secrets hidden inside the atomic nucleus. The results make no sense. The uranium is splitting into lighter elements, barium and krypton, releasing energy that should not exist according to everything known about nuclear physics. Hahn does not understand what he is seeing. He needs help. He needs the one person who might explain the impossible. But she is gone. 3 months earlier, in August 1938, a Jewish woman crossed the German border into the Netherlands, carrying a single suitcase and a diamond ring given to her by Otto Hahn as emergency currency. She had no passport, no exit visa, no legal right to leave. She had only the protection of a Dutch physicist who met her at the border, and the desperate hope that the Gestapo would not stop the train. Her name was Lise Meitner. She was 59 years old. She had worked in German physics laboratories for 30 years. She had discovered the element protactinium. She had pioneered research into radioactivity and nuclear structure. She had collaborated with Otto Hahn on experiments that would change the world. And now, because she was Jewish, she had been erased from German science, stripped of her position, declared non-existent by racial laws that made her presence illegal and her intellect worthless. She escaped. Hahn stayed. And on this December night in 1938, alone in his laboratory, staring at results he cannot explain, he writes her a letter describing what he has found. He does not know that her response, written from exile in a snow-covered village in Sweden, will split more than atoms. It will split history itself. Lise Meitner was born in Vienna on November 7th, 1870, the third of 8 children in a progressive Jewish family. Her father was a lawyer who believed in education for daughters as well as sons. Her mother encouraged intellectual curiosity. Lise showed early aptitude for mathematics and science, but faced structural barriers at every stage. Austrian schools did not permit girls to attend academic secondary education. Universities did not admit women. Lise received private tutoring and passed the entrance examination in 1901, entering the University of Vienna at age 22, when most male students began at 18. She studied physics under Ludwig Boltzmann, one of the founders of statistical mechanics. She completed her doctorate in 1906, becoming only the second woman to earn a physics PhD from the University of Vienna. She moved to Berlin in 1907 to continue research. German universities did not hire women as professors or allow them in most laboratories. Lise found work with Otto Hahn, a chemist researching radioactivity, who agreed to collaborate despite regulations prohibiting women in the chemistry building. They worked in a converted carpentry shop in the basement for 2 years until the university reluctantly granted her limited access. She received no salary. She was addressed as Hahn's assistant, despite contributing equally to the research. In 1912, she was finally offered a position at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute with a small stipend. She accepted. Over the next 25 years, she and Hahn conducted groundbreaking research on radioactive decay, neutron bombardment, and nuclear transformations. She became head of the physics department. He headed chemistry. They published jointly. Their collaboration was recognized internationally. Lise Meitner was among the most respected nuclear physicists in the world. Then Hitler came to power. The 1933 law for the restoration of the professional civil service excluded Jews from academic positions. Meitner retained her job temporarily because she was Austrian, not German, and Austria had not yet been annexed. But her position became increasingly precarious. Jewish scientists were dismissed. Research programs were dismantled. Physics itself became ideologically contaminated. The Nazi regime promoted Deutsche Physik, German physics, in opposition to what they called Jewish physics, the theoretical work of Einstein, Bohr, and others whose insights into relativity and quantum mechanics were dismissed as abstractions divorced from Aryan reality. Nuclear physics was suspect because its theoretical foundations had been largely developed by Jewish scientists. Meitner continued working, but the walls closed steadily around her. March 1938. Germany annexed Austria. Overnight, Lise Meitner became a German citizen subject to German racial laws. Her Austrian passport was invalidated. She was now officially classified as a non-Aryan, forbidden from working, publishing, or leaving the country without permission that would never be granted. The Kaiser Wilhelm Institute removed her from all official positions. Her name was struck from papers and department rosters. Otto Hahn, desperate to protect his colleague and friend, tried to arrange her departure quietly. But exit visas for Jews were nearly impossible to obtain. The borders were watched. The Gestapo maintained lists of prominent Jewish intellectuals considered flight risks. Meitner's name was on those lists. In July 1938, with help from Dutch physicist Dirk Coster, an escape plan was arranged. Coster would meet Meitner at the German-Dutch border with a temporary Dutch entry permit. She would travel by train, as if on a brief trip, carrying minimal luggage to avoid suspicion. She would cross at a small station where border checks were less rigorous. The plan depended on bureaucratic confusion and good luck. On the morning of July 13th, Lise packed a single suitcase, left her apartment in Berlin, and boarded a train north. She carried no official exit documentation. If stopped, she would be arrested immediately. At the border, Coster was waiting. German guards examined her invalid Austrian passport. They questioned her. They delayed. Coster intervened, showing his credentials and the Dutch permit. After 40 minutes of uncertainty, they let her pass. She crossed into the Netherlands and continued to Sweden, where she had been offered a temporary research position. She left everything behind. Her laboratory, her equipment, 30 years of research materials, her books, notes, and personal papers. She would never return to Germany. She would never see many of her colleagues again. She arrived in Sweden in late July 1938 and began attempting to rebuild her scientific work under conditions vastly different from what she had known in Berlin. The Swedish Research Institute was underfunded. Equipment was limited. She had no collaborators familiar with her methods. She was isolated, displaced, and deeply uncertain about her future. But she was alive, and she was still a physicist. Otto Hahn continued the experiments they had planned together. In November and December 1938, he bombarded uranium with neutrons and analyzed the resulting products using radiochemical methods. The results were baffling. Instead of producing heavier elements as expected, the uranium appeared to break apart into much lighter elements. Hahn verified the findings repeatedly, but could not explain them. The physics made no sense. Atomic nuclei were thought to be stable structures that could be chipped at, but not shattered. What Hahn was observing suggested something radically different. On December 19th, he wrote to Meitner describing the results and asking for her theoretical insight. The letter reached her in Kungälv, a small town north of Stockholm where she was spending the Christmas holiday with friends. She read Hahn's description of the experiments and immediately understood what he could not. The uranium nucleus was not stable under neutron bombardment. It was splitting. The nucleus was dividing into two roughly equal fragments, barium and krypton, releasing enormous amounts of energy in the process. The energy came from the conversion of nuclear binding mass into kinetic energy, exactly as predicted by Einstein's equation E equal to mc2. The reaction Hahn had observed was not transmutation or radioactive decay. It was fission. The atom had split. Meitner spent the next several days working through the calculations with her nephew Otto Frisch, also a physicist, who was visiting from Copenhagen. They walked through the snowy woods near Kungälv on December 23rd and 24th, discussing the implications. If the uranium nucleus could be split by a slow neutron, and if that split released additional neutrons, those neutrons could split more uranium nuclei in a chain reaction. The energy release would be exponential. A single neutron could initiate a process that would liberate unimaginable power. The theoretical possibility of an atomic bomb, previously dismissed as impractical, suddenly became frighteningly real. Meitner and Frisch wrote up their analysis and submitted it for publication. The paper, titled Disintegration of Uranium by Neutrons, a New Type of Nuclear Reaction, appeared in the journal Nature in February 1939. It explained fission and provided the first theoretical framework for understanding what Hahn had observed experimentally. Hahn published his experimental results separately, crediting Meitner's contribution in a brief acknowledgement. But the scientific community focused primarily on Hahn's chemical verification of the fission products. Meitner's theoretical explanation, published in a different journal, received less immediate attention. This separation would have lasting consequences. Over the following years, as fission research accelerated and its military implications became clear, Hahn's name became synonymous with the discovery. Meitner's role faded. The woman who had explained what fission was and how it worked began disappearing from the historical record, even as the weapon she had made theoretically possible moved from concept to reality. The discovery of fission reached scientists in America, Britain, and France within weeks. The implications were immediately obvious to those working in nuclear physics. If fission could sustain a chain reaction, it could be weaponized. Research programs began in multiple countries, initially small and exploratory. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939 and war began in earnest, the research became urgent. British and American scientists worried that German physicists who had discovered fission first might develop an atomic weapon before the Allies could. An atomic bomb in Hitler's hands would make Germany militarily invincible. The fear was well-founded. Germany had the scientific expertise. It had industrial capacity. It had access to uranium from occupied Czechoslovakia. The race for the bomb seemed weighted in Germany's favor. But Germany had made a catastrophic error. In purging Jewish scientists and dismissing Jewish physics, the Nazi regime had expelled or driven into exile the very people who understood nuclear fission most deeply. Lise Meitner was in Sweden. Otto Frisch was in Britain. Niels Bohr was in Denmark, soon to escape to America. Albert Einstein was already in the United States. The theoretical physicists who could have guided German bomb development were gone, scattered across neutral or allied nations. The physicists who remained in Germany were competent, but lacked the theoretical depth to pursue fission research effectively. Werner Heisenberg, who led the German nuclear program, made critical miscalculations about the amount of uranium required and the methods for sustaining a chain reaction. The German program stalled, delayed by theoretical errors, limited resources, and Hitler's own disinterest in projects that could not deliver immediate battlefield results. Meanwhile, the Allies assembled the greatest concentration of scientific talent ever gathered for a single purpose. The Manhattan Project brought together European refugees and American researchers in a massive, coordinated effort to build an atomic weapon before Germany could. Enrico Fermi, who had fled fascist Italy. Leo Szilard, a Hungarian Jew. Hans Bethe, expelled from Germany. Edward Teller, Niels Bohr, Rudolf Peierls, Eugene Wigner, Klaus Fuchs. The list reads like a catalogue of exiled Jewish and anti-fascist scientists whose brilliance had been rejected by the regimes that should have valued them most. They worked in secret facilities in Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Hanford, applying the principles of nuclear fission that Lise Meitner had first explained in a Swedish village on Christmas Eve 1938. Meitner was invited to join the Manhattan Project in 1943. The invitation came through American physicist Robert Oppenheimer, who recognized her theoretical expertise and wanted her involved in the bomb design calculations. She refused. Her refusal was absolute and unambiguous. She told colleagues that she would have nothing to do with a bomb. She had fled Germany to escape death and persecution. She would not contribute to a weapon designed to deliver death on an unprecedented scale. Her moral position was consistent throughout the war. She continued research in Sweden on non-military applications of nuclear physics, but declined all involvement in weapons development. She remained in Sweden, working in obscurity and limited by poor resources, while the project she had made theoretically possible moved forward without her. August 6, 1945. An American B-29 bomber dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. The bomb, designated Little Boy, used uranium fission to release energy equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. The explosion destroyed 5 square miles of the city and killed approximately 70,000 people immediately. 3 days later, a second bomb destroyed Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 15th. The war ended. The atomic age began. And Lise Meitner listening to the news in her small apartment in Stockholm, was horrified. She had known intellectually that fission could be weaponized. She had understood since 1938 that a chain reaction releasing enormous energy was theoretically achievable. But understanding the theory and confronting the reality were different experiences. The photographs from Hiroshima showed a city erased. The casualty estimates kept rising. The radiation effects were worse than predicted. People who survived the initial blast died weeks later from exposure. Meitner felt complicity despite her refusal to participate. Her equations had unlocked the process. Her theoretical work had shown it was possible. The fact that she had opposed the weapon did not erase her connection to it. In interviews years later, she spoke carefully about the bomb, expressing horror at its use while refusing to claim innocence. She had discovered something true about nature. How that truth was used was beyond her control, but the discovery itself carried weight. The world celebrated the scientists who built the bomb. Oppenheimer became famous. Fermi was honored. The Manhattan Project physicists were recognized as having ended the war and saved countless lives by making an invasion of Japan unnecessary. Lise Meitner's name did not appear in those celebrations. She had not participated in the project. Her role in discovering fission was largely forgotten or attributed solely to Otto Hahn. When the Nobel Prize in Chemistry was awarded in 1944, it went to Hahn alone for the discovery of nuclear fission. Meitner was not mentioned, not in the citation, not in Hahn's acceptance speech, not in the public narrative that formed around the bomb. The exclusion was not accidental. The Nobel Committee based its decision on Hahn's experimental verification of fission products. His radiochemical analysis had proven definitively that uranium split into barium. That was chemistry. Meitner's theoretical explanation of why it split and how much energy was released was physics. The committee separated the discovery into experimental and theoretical components and awarded the prize only for the experimental work. This separation ignored the reality that Hahn had not understood what his experiments showed until Meitner explained it. Without her theoretical framework, his experimental results were anomalies. With her explanation, they became fission. But the Nobel went to Hahn, and Meitner disappeared from the story. The erasure continued for decades. Textbooks credited Hahn with discovering fission. Scientific histories mentioned Meitner as a collaborator, but positioned her as secondary. The standard narrative became, Otto Hahn discovered fission in 1938. Lise Meitner contributed to the theoretical understanding. Over time, even that qualified acknowledgement faded. By the 1950s and 1960s, many accounts of nuclear physics history mentioned Hahn without mentioning Meitner at all. She had been written out of the discovery she had explained. Why? The reasons are complex and overlapping. Gender played a role. Physics and chemistry were male-dominated fields where women's contributions were routinely minimized or attributed to male colleagues. Jewish identity mattered. Post-war Germany sought to rehabilitate its scientific reputation. Celebrating Otto Hahn, who had remained in Germany, was more comfortable than celebrating Lise Meitner, whose Jewishness and exile reminded people of what had been done. Institutional politics influenced the Nobel decision. The committee had awarded the prize for chemistry, not physics, which allowed them to focus narrowly on experimental work and exclude theoretical contributions. Timing mattered. The prize was awarded in 1944, while the war was ongoing and Meitner was isolated in Sweden, with limited ability to advocate for her own recognition. But beneath all these factors was something simpler. Meitner had been easy to erase because she had already been erased once. The Nazis had struck her name from institutional records, removed her from publications, declared her non-existent. When the scientific community later failed to recognize her contribution, they were continuing an erasure that had already been initiated. The difference was that the Nazis had erased her deliberately and maliciously. The scientific community erased her through oversight, institutional bias, and passive acceptance of incomplete narratives. The effect was the same. A woman who had fundamentally shaped nuclear physics ceased to exist in the public memory of that field. Meitner lived in Sweden until 1960, when she moved to Britain to be near family. She continued working into her 70s, focusing on nuclear physics research, and occasionally speaking about the ethical implications of atomic weapons. She received some recognition late in her life. Element 109, Meitnerium, was named in her honor in 1997, 16 years after her death. Various scientific prizes and honors were awarded to her in the 1950s and 1960s, though none carried the weight or visibility of the Nobel Prize. She was nominated for the Nobel multiple times in subsequent years, but never selected. The committee did not revisit the 1944 decision or acknowledge that it might have been incomplete. She died in Cambridge, England, on October 27, 1968, at age 89. Her gravestone, selected by her nephew Otto Frisch, reads simply, Lise Meitner, a physicist who never lost her humanity. The epitaph captures something essential. Meitner had been a brilliant scientist who made foundational contributions to nuclear physics. She had also been a person with moral clarity who refused to participate in weapons development, even when her expertise was desperately wanted. She had maintained intellectual integrity in the face of persecution, displacement, and erasure. She had continued working when institutions rejected her, when colleagues forgot her, when history tried to write her out. And she had done so without bitterness or public complaint, simply continuing to be a physicist because that was who she was. The rediscovery of Meitner's story began in the 1990s, as historians of science started examining the gender dynamics and institutional biases that had shaped how scientific credit was assigned. Researchers found her correspondence with Otto Hahn, which made clear that she had been an equal collaborator for decades and had provided the critical theoretical insight that explained fission. They found Nobel Prize nomination records, showing that she had been nominated repeatedly, and that the committee had received letters advocating for her inclusion in the 1944 prize. They found evidence that Hahn himself had acknowledged her role in private correspondence, while downplaying it in public statements. The archival record revealed a pattern of systematic exclusion that could no longer be dismissed as simple oversight. In 1997, the journal Physics Today published an article titled Lise Meitner and the Discovery of Nuclear Fission, documenting her contribution and arguing that the 1944 Nobel Prize had been incorrectly awarded. The article generated renewed attention to Meitner's story and prompted calls for the Nobel Committee to issue a public acknowledgement of the oversight. The committee declined, citing a policy against revisiting past awards. Meitner's exclusion stands as one of the most significant errors in Nobel Prize history, alongside the exclusion of Rosalind Franklin from the DNA Discovery Prize and the failure to recognize Jocelyn Bell Burnell for discovering pulsars. All three cases involve women whose contributions were documented and significant, but who were overlooked due to gender bias and institutional dynamics that favored male colleagues. The broader significance of Meitner's story extends beyond issues of scientific credit. Her life illustrates how persecution and displacement can reshape global power structures in unexpected ways. Nazi Germany's decision to expel Jewish scientists based on racial ideology was not just morally catastrophic, but strategically suicidal. By driving away Meitner, Einstein, Bohr, Fermi, and dozens of other brilliant physicists, Germany handed the Allies the scientific expertise necessary to develop atomic weapons. Hitler's ideological commitment to anti-Semitism directly undermined Germany's military capacity. The regime that sought to dominate through technological superiority destroyed its own scientific base in pursuit of racial purity. The irony is absolute. The Jewish woman Hitler's government declared non-existent helped create the weapon Hitler feared most. Meitner herself would have rejected that framing. She did not build the bomb. She refused to build the bomb. She discovered fission as a scientific phenomenon and explained its mechanism. What others did with that knowledge was not something she controlled or wanted, but the connection exists whether she accepted it or not. Her theoretical work made the Manhattan Project possible. Without understanding fission, Allied scientists could not have designed functional weapons. The chain reaction, the critical mass calculations, the energy release predictions, all depended on the framework Meitner established in 1938 and 1939. She did not build the bomb, but the bomb could not have been built without her. That paradox defines her legacy. She contributed to the most destructive weapon ever created while refusing to participate in its development. She explained a natural phenomenon that others weaponized. She was erased from history, while simultaneously shaping that history more profoundly than most of the people who were remembered. She was a Jewish woman in a field that excluded women and a scientific establishment that would soon attempt genocide against Jewish people. She survived through exile and continued working through displacement and isolation. She maintained moral clarity while others rationalized. And she died knowing that her most significant scientific contribution had been used for purposes she found abhorrent. There is no clean resolution to this story. Meitner received belated recognition, but recognition decades late is not the same as justice. Her contribution is now acknowledged in most scientific histories, but the Nobel Prize was never corrected, and Otto Hahn remains the name most associated with fission discovery. The bomb she made possible ended a war, but initiated a nuclear arms race that threatened human extinction. Her refusal to participate in weapons development demonstrated moral courage, but did not prevent the weapons from being built. She was rediscovered by historians, but remains unknown to most people who learned about World War II or atomic physics in school. What remains is the archival evidence, her letters to Hahn explaining fission, her calculations written in notebooks that survived in Swedish Research Institute archives, her publications, co-authored with Otto Frisch, that provided the first theoretical framework for nuclear fission. Her correspondence with colleagues expressing horror at Hiroshima and high relief at having refused to participate in the Manhattan Project. Her epitaph, chosen by her nephew, declaring that she never lost her humanity. These fragments constitute the documentary record of a life that shaped history while being systematically excluded from historical memory. In a filing cabinet at Churchill College, Cambridge, there is a folder containing Lise Meitner's papers donated by her family after her death. Among the documents is a letter dated August 8, 1945, 2 days after Hiroshima. The letter is from a Swedish colleague asking her to comment publicly on the atomic bomb and her role in the physics that made it possible. Meitner's response, drafted in pencil on a half sheet of paper, is brief. She wrote that she would have nothing to say about the bomb because she had nothing to do with it. She wrote that the physics of fission was a scientific discovery about how nature works, not a political statement. She wrote that she hoped people would understand the difference. The draft is crossed out. She never sent the letter. Instead, she maintained silence. That silence was strategic and necessary. Speaking publicly about the bomb would have forced her to defend positions. She could not defend or claim innocence she did not fully believe. Silence allowed her to continue living as a physicist and a person without becoming a symbol or a target. But silence also meant that her perspective, the perspective of someone who had discovered fission and rejected its weaponization, was lost from public discourse about atomic weapons. The Manhattan Project scientists debated the morality of the bomb. Political leaders justified its use. Victims described its horror. But the woman whose theoretical work had enabled it all remained silent, living quietly in Sweden, and then Britain, working on nuclear physics problems that had nothing to do with explosions. She was interviewed occasionally in her later years. Journalists would ask about fission, about the bomb, about Otto Hahn, and the Nobel Prize. Her responses were measured and careful. She confirmed her role in explaining fission. She expressed regret about the bomb without claiming she could have prevented it. She said Otto Hahn had been a good colleague, and that the Nobel Committee had made their decision based on what they valued. She did not express bitterness. She did not demand recognition. She simply stated facts and declined to elaborate. The interviewers often seemed disappointed. They wanted drama, anger, vindication. Meitner offered only clarity and restraint. That restraint reflected her scientific training and her personal character. She had spent her career in fields that valued precision, evidence, and understatement. She had survived exile and erasure by not drawing attention to herself. Speaking dramatically about injustice or claiming credit aggressively would have contradicted everything she had learned about how to navigate institutions that did not want her. So she remained measured. She accepted what recognition came late in life. She continued working. She maintained relationships with colleagues who had overlooked her. And she died without writing a memoir or making a public case for historical revision. She simply lived as a physicist who had discovered something important and then watched others use it in ways she found deeply troubling. The question is whether that silence was chosen or imposed. Did Meitner decline recognition because she genuinely did not want it, or because seeking it would have been futile and potentially damaging? The evidence suggests both. She was not someone who sought spotlight or craved public validation, but she also understood that as a Jewish woman in a male-dominated field, asserting her contributions too forcefully would likely backfire. Better to accept quiet acknowledgement from peers than risk alienating the scientific community by demanding justice that might never come. The strategy kept her working and respected within her field. It also ensured that the broader public never learned her name or understood her role in atomic history. Today, Lise Meitner appears in some textbooks and documentaries about nuclear physics. Her story is taught in some university courses on the history of science. Element 109 carries her name, a recognition that would have pleased her more than prizes or public fame. But she remains largely unknown outside academic circles. The average person who knows that an atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima does not know that a Jewish woman refugee explained the physics that made the bomb possible. The average person who learns about the Manhattan Project does not learn that the scientist who discovered fission was excluded from the Nobel Prize that recognized that discovery. The erasure is not complete, but it is substantial, and perhaps that is appropriate. Meitner herself seemed to believe that the work mattered more than the recognition. She was a physicist because she wanted to understand how nature worked, not because she wanted fame or credit. She had discovered nuclear fission not to build a weapon, but to understand atomic structure. The fact that her discovery was weaponized and that she was erased from the credit were separate problems, neither of which changed the fundamental truth of what she had found. The uranium nucleus could split. The energy release followed from mass energy equivalence. The chain reaction was theoretically possible. Those facts remained true regardless of who received prizes or whose name appeared in textbooks. But historical memory matters because it shapes how we understand the past and who we recognize as having shaped it. When Meitner is erased from the story of nuclear fission, the narrative becomes simpler and less accurate. It becomes a story of male scientists discovering powerful truths and building weapons to end wars. The actual story is more complex. It involves a Jewish woman refugee whose persecution forced her into exile, whose theoretical brilliance explained something her male colleague had observed but not understood, and whose moral clarity led her to refuse participation in the weapon her discovery enabled. That complexity matters. It reveals how scientific progress intersects with political persecution, how credit is assigned based on gender and institutional power, and how the people who understand the implications of their discoveries most deeply are often those with the least power to control how those discoveries are used. Lise Meitner understood nuclear fission better than almost anyone alive in 1945. She understood that splitting the atom released enormous energy. She understood that energy could sustain a chain reaction. She understood that the chain reaction could be weaponized. And she understood that weaponizing it would unleash destruction on a scale humanity was not prepared to manage morally or politically. She was right about all of it. The bomb worked. The destruction was unprecedented. The nuclear arms race threatened civilization, and the world forgot her name while remembering the explosion. History remembered the generals who ordered the bomb dropped. It remembered the pilots who flew the missions. It remembered Oppenheimer, who led the project, and Truman, who made the decision. It remembered Otto Hahn, who received the Nobel Prize. It did not remember Meitner, who had explained what fission was and how it worked, who had walked through snowy Swedish woods on Christmas Eve 1938, calculating the energy release from a splitting nucleus, who had refused to participate in the Manhattan Project, and who had maintained her humanity while the world weaponized her insights. But she was there, in the archives, in the letters, in the equations that made the bomb possible, and the moral refusal that kept her hands clean. Her silence did not erase her contributions, it only made them harder to see. And sometimes, in the cold light of history, the hardest things to see are the most important. The woman who fled Germany with nothing, who explained the atoms splitting with a pencil and paper in exile, who refused to build the weapon, even when asked, who received no prize for the discovery that enabled the bomb, who died quietly in Britain with an epitaph about never losing her humanity. She was there. She mattered. The silence does not change that. It only reminds us how easily we forget the people whose insights reshape the world while their names disappear from memory.